Hi everyone, this is Kyler, and this is not week 7 of my series on the prodigal son. For the past 6 weeks, I have been doing a video based on the story of the prodigal son, and there's going to be more of that to come, but this week I actually was doing some reading in the book of Ezekiel, and I came across something I really wanted to share with you. So we're going to switch it up a little bit this week, and I'm going to talk about Ezekiel, and then we're going to get back into the prodigal son next week. What I'm going to be talking about in Ezekiel is the first 3 chapters, actually primarily 2 and 3, which is Ezekiel's calling story from God. Chapter 1 in Ezekiel, actually, it starts off where Ezekiel is by the river Kebar in Babylon after they had been exiled with the rest of Israel, or the large portion of Israel, somewhere into Mesopotamia, near the Euphrates River is where we think this is. But this chapter 1 is all about a crazy cool vision that Ezekiel has. If you want to get an image of it, on YouTube actually there's some awesome videos, and they'll do some animation. They'll have some cool ideas to kind of give you a picture of what's going on there. It has probably the cherubim, it has the Son of Man on a sapphire throne, all sorts of really cool imagery, and a really spectacular display in this vision that God gives to Ezekiel. But I really want to focus on chapter 2 and 3 this week, which is when God gives Ezekiel his calling. So if you want, go ahead and put the video on pause, read all the way through chapters 2 and 3 because they're kind of long, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing here. So go ahead and do that now. Going on into chapter 2, Ezekiel hears the voice of God at the very end of his vision. And he says, the Spirit entered him, and he stood on his feet. And God tells him, this is what God says. He says, I am sending you to the sons of Israel, to a rebellious people who have rebelled against me. Now, if you read this chapter and the next one, the people of Israel being rebellious is a really common theme in how God speaks to Israel through Ezekiel. Actually, it's a really common theme in Israel in the Old Testament. They're constantly rebelling against the law that God has handed down to them. So God's telling Ezekiel now, he says, you shall speak my words to them, whether they listen or not, which is another pattern that God uses in these 2 chapters. He says they might not listen to you. They probably won't, as a matter of fact, because they're a rebellious group, but you're going to speak my words to them regardless. And then at the end of chapter 2 here, a weird thing happens. God says to Ezekiel, eat what I am giving to you. And the Son of Man, who Ezekiel's speaking with, extends his hand and gives over a scroll to Ezekiel. And you're like, wait, Ezekiel's supposed to eat the scroll? I really don't understand what's going on. In the beginning of chapter 3, Ezekiel actually puts the scroll into his mouth, eats it, and he says it tastes sweet like honey. And I did a little digging into this, and it looks like it's actually referring back to Jeremiah 15, verse 16, where Jeremiah says, your words were found, and I ate them. Your words became for me a joy and the delight of my heart. So this is just a really cool kind of side note in here, but this weird idea of eating a scroll is just probably symbolic for God putting the words in Ezekiel's mouth. It's like a physical symbol for the words of God coming from within Ezekiel. So then we move into chapter 3, and like I said, that starts with him eating the scroll. But then God goes into telling Ezekiel, he says, I have sent you to those who should listen to you. Yet the house of Israel will not be willing to listen to you, since they were not willing to listen to me. So kind of an interesting calling for Ezekiel. It's almost like God is sending him on Mission Impossible, something that's not going to happen, and God knows it's not going to happen, yet he's sending him anyways. After getting this message from God, Ezekiel ends up spending the next 7 days among people who lived by the river at Tel Aviv, which is nearby along the same river. And it says that he was embittered in the rage of his spirit. Some other translations even say that he spent the 7 days in bitterness in the heat of his spirit. Regardless, Ezekiel was not a happy guy. He was not thrilled with the idea of living this calling that God was giving to him. As a matter of fact, he was angry and probably very stunned because it was dangerous, because he would not be popular, and because he knows, as God has already told him, they're not going to listen to you. You're not going to be successful. So that's a pretty tough pill to swallow for Ezekiel. But after 7 days, God says, Son of man, I have appointed you a watchman to the house of Israel. Whenever you hear a word from my mouth, warn them from me. And then God goes on to say, if you do what I say, then they are responsible for how they respond. But if you do not tell them what I tell you to tell them, then their blood, their death, their sin is on your hands, Ezekiel. So it seems like God here almost is trying to give Israel a fair shake. Like, hey, I know they're probably not going to listen, but if I didn't send anybody, then, it's my job as God. I have to send them someone. I have to give them some sort of warning. It's like they have some sort of deal and God is contractually obligated, even though he knows that they're not going to listen to him. He's giving them this kind of like a fair chance to repent and turn around. Then after this, Ezekiel goes on and he does this calling. He warns Israel of the coming destruction of Jerusalem due to their sins, proclaiming all these laments, telling them to turn against their ways and change. But they don't listen to him. They're not interested in hearing what Ezekiel has to say. Until then, Jerusalem is actually destroyed, and then they're really interested in what Ezekiel has to say all of a sudden. Funny how that works. So then Ezekiel's message, though, changes from prophecies of like lament, saying, hey, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed because of sin, but then he actually flips his message around and it becomes more about the redemption for the city of Jerusalem. Now, why I love this passage is because I think it applies to us really well today. And we're going to dig into that a little bit here. If God knows that people will not listen to Ezekiel, why does he send him? Now, personally, I think it's for when they look backwards. Now, it's obvious that I said, like, it sounds like God is trying to give him a fair shake. It's like almost like he feels obligated to do this. He's sending someone because it's what God does. But I think there's more to that, because I think there's a greater purpose to Ezekiel than to just be a pawn in some obligation of the covenant between God and Israel. I think that what Ezekiel is, his true purpose, is to speak against the sins that has caused Israel to be destroyed as a nation, so that later, after the destruction happens, which God knows is going to happen, they can look back and they have a sort of lighthouse saying, look, here's where the rocks were. If we find ourselves going this way again, we need to stop and turn around because it led us to destruction the first time around. So I think that's what Ezekiel's calling is and why God sent him in the first place. And I think in the same way, we are actually called to be lighthouses in our context, warning people out of love when we see destruction coming their way. I call that sin. Anything that causes destruction, the disruption of peace, the disruption of shalom. We should see those things and be lighthouses, be watchmen to call out those things so that the people we love don't go into destruction in them. So there's a few more thoughts here. When we read passages like this, particularly in the Old Testament, we are actually getting a glimpse into how the writer and his culture interprets the situation surrounding them. Now, while God speaks directly to Ezekiel, obviously, through the whole book you see that, a major piece of Ezekiel's cultural paradigm is the spirituality of keeping the law. When you keep the law, God makes you flourish. When you don't keep the law, God punishes you. Now, is it possible today that we have a new perspective? The sins of Israel rested primarily in idolatry, whether that is of other gods, of sex, of money, of power. But idolatry leads to greed, to selfishness, to oppression, to injustice. Those are all actions that come from the root of the idolatry of what you're idolizing. So is it possible then that we see through Ezekiel a God who's trying to get the Israelites to realize what exactly caused them to fall apart as a nation? Is this rather than a law that is all about spiritual, it's all about pleasing a divine being in order to not get punished? Maybe instead, God's trying to tell the Israelites and trying to show them a way to live this life that gives you success. That is the best way to live this life. This way, their nation isn't destroyed or torn apart by greed, by racism, by tribalism, by power struggles, all these different things that cause disruption to shalom and ultimately made Israel a weakness they made Israel weaker as a nation. So how does this speak to our nation in our context? Surely we don't see any issues of greed or racism or tribalism or sexism or oppression or lust, anything like that. We don't see any of those idols in our nation, right? This idolatry, just like Israel, could ultimately lead to the destruction of our nation and our world as well. So then how do we, like Ezekiel, live our calling to be watchmen in the world? Probably looks like getting involved. It probably looks like loving conversation. It probably looks a whole lot like Jesus. So that's what I have for this week. I know it's a little longer than normal, so thanks for sticking with me. Next week, I promise I will be back onto the prodigal son, but thank you for allowing me to share this word that I got from the book of Ezekiel this week. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week.